Would you mind guiding us through the African experience outside of Africa? How common was their presence in places like Persia, Greece, and Rome? Did they obtain positions of power and prestige? And if so, can you give us some examples of this? And my point for this question is to hopefully dispel a very wide misconception that these great civilizations like Greece and Rome and Persia were somehow homogeneous. Could you guide us through that?
Sure. So, first off, let's start with the fact that oftentimes when we hear of people, skin color and things are never mentioned, and where they come from are only sometimes mentioned or not. Oftentimes it's like if we find inscriptions, this is how we can actually pinpoint certain individuals who might come from an area. We have sort of tantalizing hints of things like Terence, right? Terence's name, the Roman comic poet, his name is Terence Offair, which is, a black man from Africa. What does that mean? Does this mean that he's black African or not? We do know that he was a formerly enslaved person and he'd been freed. The question always comes up of whether Augustine could be called black. So oftentimes the questions are really, we don't know the answers to whether individuals were or not. I think that we should consider that if someone is called by the Romans or to be from Africa, that we can assume that they are in some way black, or, obviously they might be of Phoenician descent. What are Berbers? Well, Berber isn't actually a ethnic marker or a marker at all of skin color in any way. That just isn't how Berber works. The word means like nomad or traveler or something. So I think we just have to, a lot of times it's guesswork. But what we can say is that there is lots and lots and lots of evidence that we have from classical antiquity, starting obviously as far back as the Egyptians, but well into the late antique world, of people who we would call Black African as being not uncommon, maybe more common in some areas than others, but not uncommon throughout the Mediterranean and living lives like other people. One of the things that we can't answer is how many people who are immigrants in Athens who are called Egyptian are in fact black or not black. How many people who are functionaries of the cult of Isis are what we would call black or not black, because the iconography that we have intermixes people who would be considered black or not black together in the worship of the cult of Isis. In Rome, in Pompeii, in Athens, throughout all the places where the cult of Isis was perpetuated. And the cult of Isis, of course, was everywhere. And here I would actually point to an archaeology student I know. Her name is Bet Hux. She is, I believe, at Heidelberg, but she did a recent podcast interview on digital Hammurabi, so it might be good to link up, where she actually talks about her expertise is in the cult of Isis and the representations of Egyptians and Aegyptica sort of throughout the Greco-Roman world. Yes, Dash, we know. And she has documented all this evidence that shows, how widespread the cult of Isis was and how integrated it was. So, but we can often assume that the people who function as priests or priestesses of the cult of Isis are in fact from Africa. And these are people who have high levels of authority. Just from my own work in Athens, dealing with cataloging tombs of foreign women in Athens, we have lots of tombs that clearly show priestesses of the cult of Isis. And we know this because they're holding certain instruments in their hands, and also sometimes there's an inscription that will go along with it. But these are high-level functionaries in a major temple or a major cult in the Greek or the Roman world. And so this is going to be one way that we're going to see lots of Africans sort of moving out into the rest of the Mediterranean. And this happens fairly early. The Athenian cult of Isis came at the very, very end of the 5th century and was well established throughout the 4th century. So it's already very much established. And while we do see evidence of prejudice against people that they refer to as Egyptian, my favorite one being, it's a really great legal lawsuit, but we only have fragments of it, so I don't think a lot of people read it. But it is the story of an Athenian man who falls in love with an enslaved boy, and he wants to buy the enslaved boy from his enslaver. And instead, the enslaver, who apparently turns out, according to the speech, he's like in severe debt, and the father and brother of the enslaved boy that this Athenian citizen is in love with, he apparently had been running a couple of businesses, and he's in severe debt. And so the enslaver wants to get rid of him, because if you buy the slave, you buy the debt. So they concoct this whole story to get this Athenian citizen to buy the whole family, and then he can free them himself, right? And then how won't the boy be so grateful that he's been freed? And then, of course, he'll love you. But it turns out the guy is now appealing in the courts, because he's saying, well, little did I know this guy owns 8 talents in debt. And it's like this massive amount of money that now he, the new owner, is on the hook for. And so in his attacks on the person he bought the slave boy, the enslaved boy and the family from, he says, he's a scoundrel, he's a cheat, and oh my God, he's Egyptian, right? That's like the big, he's even Egyptian. So we know there's obviously some prejudice and tension there. But this is a guy who is clearly wealthy. He clearly owns a lot of property and has a life in Athens and is integrating with the citizens and is selling them property and is pulling one over on them. So they're integrated into the economies and into places. And these aren't necessarily big famous people, but they are in fact part of the everyday fabric of life. And then of course we have art objects all over the place, that portrait statues and things that are just of people who we would say have Black African features. So they're clearly either dying and setting up their tombstones, or they are part of military operations in various places. We see tombs for them in Roman places. We also see on relief sculptures, sometimes when they have sort of soldiers lined up, we see people who might have specific features. Obviously, they're showing up in Persian documents, Persian relief inscriptions and things. So this idea that there are no Black Africans in the Mediterranean world is laughable, and that they weren't just living their lives like everybody else is laughable. They experienced the same kinds of prejudices that others. I mean, if you're in Athens, if you're not an Athenian citizen, you're a medic, and you are subject to being sold into enslavement, whether you are Lysias and one of the wealthiest men in the city and his family, whether you're a common prostitute, and whether you are a Greek or not Greek. They don't distinguish within the category. You're simply not Athenian. And the Spartans are the same way, right? So this idea that people are being singled out for prejudice because they are quote unquote, Black or they're African, more than anybody else, in a Greek structure at least, is kind of, to me, I don't see it anywhere. I haven't seen it in any of my sources anywhere. What I see really is Athenians hating on everyone, right? And again, if you're a Roman, if you do, I think one of the assumptions is, so here's a data point that I learned from Caitlin Green on her blog. She does late antiquity, mostly in medieval period, but she did a study of the slave trade in North Africa through the Sahara in the Roman period. And we're talking 6 to 8 million people moved at that time. Now, one of the things, of course, we have to be super, super careful for is never equate in antiquity Blackness with enslavement. That's just not how it works at all. But we do know that there was just as much, there was a major slave trade coming out of the Black Sea, right? Scythians, Thracians, etc. Major slave trade in Gaul and Germany. I mean, where do you think Caesar got all of his money? He committed genocide in Gaul, but he sold more of them into enslavement than he killed. That's how he made all of his money, was this 10 years of selling the Gallic population and conquered Germans into enslavement. So we're having slaves come from all over, but we do know about this major point of the slave trade. There was the Garamantes in North Africa, who are the main slave traders, enslavers, and they're selling people into the sort of broader Mediterranean market. So they're moving all over the place. But if you're in a Roman world and you get bought by a Roman citizen and you get freed, you become a citizen, and your children become citizens. So this idea that there are no Black African Roman citizens is also absurd, just based on the data itself and on, physical evidence of it. And of course, we know of the Roman legions from North Africa being stationed up in Britain and in other places. And these are most likely, many of them, Black. So they're not living some sort of invisible existence in the ancient Mediterranean. Now this is, and here's where I would actually point to the work of Caitlin Barrett, who's at Cornell, and she's an archaeologist who works in North Africa. And she works on representations of Nilotic scenes, sort of scenes of the Nile in the Roman world. And of course, one of the things that you see very frequently is you see these wall paintings all over Pompeii, right, of pygmies fighting with crocodiles and hippopotami by artists who clearly have never seen a hippopotamus before and think it's actually a horse with like sharp teeth and big head that lives in the water. And so there is obviously this sort of fantasy that attaches sometimes to Blackness. One of my favorite sculptures is in the Naples Museum now, and it is of a Black African acrobat. And I can give you an image of that to show, but it's actually part of a water fountain. So his mouth actually shoots water out. We don't know what the rest of the fountain looked like. But so there clearly is a mark on Blackness as exotic in some instances, and we know that in some texts, like in Petronius' Satyricon, that the idea of having a Black slave was considered, to have a Black person who's an enslaved person is considered valuable in many ways. We also know, though, that in Pliny, we're told that they're bringing up to Rome for display crocodiles and a baby hippopotamus, because Lord knows you cannot transport to Rome an adult hippopotamus. They're like the most dangerous creatures alive. But Pliny tells us one time of a baby hippopotamus being brought to Rome, and its handlers are there working. And these are not, as far as we can tell, these are free people who happen to be people who handle crocodiles, and they sort of in the traffic of exotic animals for the Romans. And so they're part of the sort of entertainment structure that comes to the city of Rome. So we have all this evidence of them being around. We also have evidence of them being exoticized, and we do have some minor evidence of obviously of the idea of people being Egyptian, or Egyptians in particular, as being a sort of a slur on someone's name. But we find those references amongst people who think that being a Spartan is also a slur, or it's like, oh my God, you're from Megara, God forbid. Or if you're an Athenian, right, you're like, oh my God, what's worse than being Egyptian is being Macedonian, right? So you have to take the context of where we see references to anti-Blackness, and recognize that you only have those kinds of prejudices if you're around people enough to see them. Or oftentimes it's rooted in an individual bad experience, like this poor Athenian citizen trying to buy a slave boy that he's fallen in love with from an Egyptian medic resident in Athens. So I would say one of the things we need to sort of take away is, one, the ancient Mediterranean is not a white space. It's filled with people from all over. That people who we would call Black Africans are all over the Mediterranean, and they are living lives like everybody else. They're merchants, they're entertainers, they're soldiers, they are shop owners, they are teachers, they are playwrights. They become, of course, in the Christian period, they become very, very heavily part of the early Christian church. We know that the kingdom of Ethiopia was the earliest fully converted, officially Christian kingdom in the ancient world. And so they are part of the Christian hierarchies very early on. And so we see them everywhere. And so this idea that, it's like I said, again, this sort of impermeable boundary between the Sahara and North Africa and the Mediterranean is a false idea that doesn't work. And there's tons of evidence, visual evidence and literary evidence to show that that Black people were all over the ancient Mediterranean, and that most of them lived just like everybody else, and weren't set off as rare or distinct.